In Great Britain, the early 19th century was the start of the railway age. The explosion in mass transport was one of the features of the Victorian enterprise culture, and the invention of the steam engine in its active development was the powerhouse that enabled this small island to win dominance in the industrial world, so much so that Britain's golden age was the railway age. After the famous Rainhill trials of 1829, won by the immortal Stephenson locomotive rocket, the possibilities of transporting people as well as goods by the Iron Road grasped the popular imagination. In the first decade of the century, the fastest a man had travelled was that of a galloping horse. By the middle of the century, a mile a minute was almost a daily event, and shortly after the turn of the century, the magical 100 was breached. All this happened because railways were the cutting edge of technology. Enormous railway empires were built up throughout the country, in the empire and overseas generally. But in Great Britain, no railway dared to believe it was fully formed unless it had a main line that served London itself. So an express train could only be one hauled by steam from the capital. This belief was to cost some railways dear. Our opening scenes depict Marylebone, the last London terminus to be built in the last decade of the 19th century. It was constructed by the Great Central Railway, a provincial concern whose previous name, the Manchester, Sheffield and Railway, precisely described its origins. The story of the Great Central is so fascinating that it has its own programme in this series of the railway age. So here we will concentrate on some of the other railways that served the city and connected it to the great industrial areas of the Midlands and the North. Those railways' titles summed up their roots and ambitions: the Great Northern Railway, the London and North Western Railway, the Midland Railway. All these were trunk routes feeding the great metropolis. Serving its people as well were the suburban and commuter railways, such as the Great Eastern, the London, Tilbury and Southend, the District Railway and the Metropolitan Railway. The great Victorian railways were merged to form four major groups of railways in the early 1920s. The London and North Western and Midland Railways, arch rivals, became the principal components of the new London, Midland and Scottish Railway, which consequently had two major trunk routes into London. This railway produced the famous Stanier Pacifics, one of which, City of Leeds, is seen here. These locomotives, the most powerful British express locomotives of the interwar years, were the symbols of the LMS. A number of them were streamlined during the vogue for such embellishments, and they were produced specifically to head the railway's Anglo-Scottish passenger expresses on the old London and North Western's main line. Curiously, the Midland Main Line's principal express, the Thames Clyde Express, never saw Stanier Pacific power. Although grouped together, the traditions of the Midland and the LNWR were very different and survived during grouping. The LNWR, serving cities such as Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Lancaster and Glasgow, ran long, heavy trains, whilst the Midland, serving the East Midlands, primarily Leicester, Derby, Nottingham, Sheffield and Leeds, ran frequent light trains. Whilst the Stanier Pacifics were used on the LNWR trains, the Midland Expresses had 460s such as the Jubilees and the mixed-traffic Black Fives and their British Railways cousins, the celebrated symbol of LMS unity, as they could be found on duties throughout the LMS system from St Pancras to Thurso. These scenes are of the Midland Railway's stronghold in the East Midlands, Leicester. The railway's heartland was centred on Derby, from which its original main line ran south to Birmingham and ultimately Bristol. Its London main line came later. Indeed, it was a late entrant to London, the capital, not having been the raison d'etre of the Midland Railway. However, it quickly became an important destination for the industrial products of the Midlands, especially the coal traffic, for which the Midlands London main line became legendary. The LNWR had, as the London and Birmingham Railway, built the first trunk railway from a London base, opening in 1838. The Midland made a connection with the LNWR at Rugby and obtained running rights into London. To the east, it obtained similar rights over the Great Northern in 1857, after the delays over the LNWR became intolerable. However, the Great Northern could cope no better, matters coming to a head during the 1862 Great Exhibition, when nearly 3,500 Midland trains for London were delayed. The Midland was therefore forced to build its own direct line into London, which took place during the 1860s, opening throughout in 1868, 30 years after the LNWR had opened at Euston. The Midland had come together before the heat of the railway mania of the 1840s. It was built up by the great George Hudson, known as the Railway King. He expanded it rapidly during the mania, fighting off opposition to his line, which had formed the first through route from York to the capital, using its link to the LNWR. The Midland Railway pivoted on its headquarters at Derby, the original main line running from York to Birmingham via the city. Derby became a byword for all things Midland, and the great locomotive works are seen in the background here, as a very non-Derby locomotive visited it during the end of steam days. The locomotive is a Southern Railway Bullied Pacific. These were regarded by critics as too large for the traffic on their home system, an exact contrast to the reputation that Derby built up for Midland locomotives. In its independent days, the Derby philosophy was to build small engines. If trains got before them, they simply doubled the number of trains, or locomotives, at the head of the trains. Long coal trains with two small Midland 060 tender engines at the head became a well-known feature of the London main line as the railway developed the traffic from the South Yorkshire, Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire coalfields. This was hopelessly inefficient in days of high labour costs. British Railways replaced them with the powerful 9F 210Os, which supplemented the LMS's own powerful Stanier 8F 280Os, the standard goods engines of the immediate pre-war period. In North London, vast marshalling yards were created at Cricklewood, where small tank locomotives known as ginties continued to shunt the yards until displaced by diesel shunters. The ginties were the LMS development of an earlier Midland design, and were the product of the early period of LMS locomotive policy, where Derby's philosophy reigned supreme. We're aboard a brake van on a train headed by one of the ginties as it works its way around the Midlands lines in North London, passing suburban passenger trains and mile upon mile of sorting sidings. Standing at a signal, we await the passage of a Midland Line express headed by a Jubilee. These were the products of Sir William Stanier, who followed Sir Henry Fowler, both of whose suburban tank engines are seen next, as the LMS chief mechanical engineer. Fowler was a Midland man through and through, brought up in Derby traditions. And it wasn't until Stanier replaced him in the 1930s that the LMS got the locomotives it needed. The Midland was forever an expansionist railway, and once it reached London, it turned its eyes eastwards to the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, a pure commuter line along the Thames estuary, which it acquired. It promptly put its stamp on the Tilbury line, but didn't introduce its own locomotives, rather building machines with Midland characteristics to the unusual 442 specification. One of the original Tilbury machines, Thundersley, preserved today, is seen celebrating the railway centenary in 1956. London was ringed by suburban commuter railways, some of which, like the Tilbury line, fell into the British Railway sphere of operations, and some of which became part of the capital's own transport system, London Transport. Collectively known as the Underground, these railways included some normal railways, such as the Metropolitan Railway, which operated branch lines into the outer suburban countryside. These included the Chesham branch, which was steam-operated into the 1950s, and led to the retention of some ancient coaching stock and locomotives. This locomotive, an 044 tank, numbered L44 by London Transport, was the Metropolitan's number 1, and it was eventually bought for preservation. This led to its returning to its old haunts in 1989 to celebrate the centenary of the Chesham branch. Number 1 today resides at another Metropolitan Railway outpost, the Buckinghamshire Steam Centre at Quainton Road. It was hired by London Underground Limited as part of a series of steam workings, which have become an annual event on the old Metropolitan lines around Watford and Harrow. This is Chorley Wood Station, not quite what one imagines a station on the underground network to look like. Met number 1 is next seen crossing the Grand Union Canal at Watford. These steam workings have taken place at weekends and provided much publicity and goodwill for LUL. Another branch to see steam is the Stanmore line. This was a train for staff only. The coaches, curiously, were hired from British Railways, from the London, Tilbury and Southend line. Locomotive returned the compliment and ran on LUL's lines alongside the Tilbury route to celebrate Upminster's Open Day. Other locomotives familiar on London suburban services have also appeared on the Metropolitan steam turns. This is a Great Western pannier tank seen with Met number 1 at Neasden Depot, where all steam workings have been based. It seems incongruous alongside typical underground electric stock. This is Chalfont and Latimer, the junction for the Chesham branch. A visitor from East Anglia in 1992 brought back memories of another of the great London suburban railways. This is a Class N7 Great Eastern Railway tank locomotive. The Great Eastern was truly one of the greatest users of steam in the capital city. At a time when other railways were looking to electrification to increase the efficiency of their suburban workings, the Great Eastern took the opposite view. They decided to invest in small, efficient steam tank engines for their services to Stratford, Chingford, Ilford and the Essex commuter belts, and the intensive workings from Liverpool Street in the early decades of this century became legendary as the Jazz Service. The complex formations of railways in London is well illustrated at Wembley as the N7 tank emerges from a burrowing junction from Neasden. Most suburban routes have complicated junctions as the service frequency is such that trains cannot impede each other's progress as they cross from main lines to branches. Flyovers are common in the metropolis. Our last view is one of the final type of large suburban tank locomotive, a British Railways standard Class 4 264 tank. A number of these, including this one, worked over the Midlands Tilbury line in the 1950s, before it was electrified by British Railways. We returned to steam days in the 50s aboard an express on the Midland's main line into St Pancras, seeing classic views of the suburban sprawl as we passed through new commuter stations. Curiously, the Midland, although with an active suburban service, had very few branches, a product of its late arrival in London and its real purpose, a trunk route linked to the Midlands. The great overall roof of St Pancras Station is a monument to the Midland. The station was built in the grand style and is today a listed building, but even so, proposed as the North London terminus for trains from the new Channel Tunnel. Cheek by jowl alongside St Pancras is King's Cross Station, the terminus for Midland trains when they gained access to London by the Great Northern Railway. This famous London station was the Great Northern's headquarters and became almost legendary in its successors' days, when the London and North Eastern Railway ran some of the most famous trains of all from here up the East Coast Main Line. The LNER produced a continuing series of large Pacific locomotives from 1922 to the early 1950s, when it was part of British Railways. They were built to the designs of the great Sir Nigel Gresley, Edward Thompson and Arthur Peppercorn, and powered such trains as the Flying Scotsman, the Silver Jubilee, the Coronation, and the Queen of Scots to the industrial cities of the east coast of Great Britain. The LNER locomotive was in direct contrast to that of the Midland, it eventually having more Pacifics than any other British railway. The platform ends at King's Cross were a mecca for the train spotters of all ages. Just beyond the tunnels at the north end of the station, the railway climbed through a series of cuttings and up fierce gradients as locomotives got to grips with the many expresses to the north. In the cuttings at Copenhagen Junction, the Great Northern had lines to its separate King's Cross goods station and connections to the independent North London line, which crossed it at right angles and served as a connection between the great railways which served the capital. Copenhagen Junction also served the Great Northern Railway's King's Cross locomotive shed, forever known as Top Shed. Here the great Pacifics were serviced, from the famous Gresley streamliners of the A4 class, known to the enthusiasts as Streaks, to the more humble 460s of Class B1, and the myriad of goods locomotives which powered the freights from the adjacent goods yards. Pacifics of all types were paraded here. This is an example of the final design, Peppercorn's A1 class, which were built after the LNER had become part of British Railways in 1948. Today there's a plan to build one more, as none survived British Railways' holocaust for steam in the 1960s. Outside the shed, one of the earliest Pacifics of Class A3 heads north. These were the first successful Pacifics in Great Britain, and the third one built has become the most famous steam locomotive of all, Flying Scotsman. The A3s were the mainstay of the LNER steam services from the capital to the east coast cities of Doncaster, Leeds, York, Newcastle, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. Pride of place goes to the A4s and the second most famous locomotive, Mallard, the fastest steam engine of all time. Steam also took Londoners to the seaside. A3 and A1 Pacifics pass outside the entrance to the shed. When British Railways modernised their system in the 1960s and disposed of steam, the West Coast route from Euston was electrified, but the East Coast was dieselised. We've moved out into the northern suburbs of London at Potters Bar and Hatfield, where the expresses were able to build up speed. We're going to follow the East Coast main line from one capital to the other, as the LNER connected London and Edinburgh, the result of the amalgamation of three great Victorian railway companies in 1923, the Great Northern, the North Eastern and the North British. Together they'd formed a working relationship to create the East Coast main line, using through coaches but changing locomotives en route. After amalgamation, the LNER introduced through locomotive working as well, some of the big Pacifics being fitted with special tenders with corridors connecting them to the first coach of the train to enable non-stop working between the capitals, changing drivers and firemen en route. This is Flying Scotsman at the end of her British Railways career. The end of steam on the East Coast Main Line came in 1966. Here we pass Union of South Africa, making her way to King's Cross to take the last train north. The first major city served by trains from London was Peterborough, a junction station for cross-country services to East Anglia, the Fens and across to the East Midlands. Most expresses called as the station was built with a severe speed restriction through its platforms. This is 6009 Union of South Africa with the last train. We move on to see an A3 at speed with a southbound express. All along the main line, there were locomotive servicing points or sheds. Peterborough had New England Shed, and major sheds existed at Grantham, Doncaster, York, Gateshead and Edinburgh, at which the A4s and other Pacifics were maintained. Here an A4 emerges from behind a British Railways 9F goods engine. The A4s were the legendary speed kings of the railway. They sported a great variety of names, the first four bearing names with a silver theme, Silver Fox being embellished with a fox on its boiler side. These were introduced for the first of the non-stop streamlined expresses of the 1930s, the Silver Jubilee. The coronation between London and Edinburgh followed as the second streamliner, and a batch of A4s was specially named after members of the British Empire and Commonwealth to work this train. Dominion of Canada was preserved and now resides in a museum near Montreal. One of the smaller V2 class 262s makes a call with a mixed parcels and passenger train. These versatile mixed traffic locomotives were scaled down from the Pacific design, but were nearly as competent and a feature of the Eastern route for a quarter of a century or more. A later design of mixed traffic locomotive was the post-war Thompson B1 460, which were also at home on passenger or freight duties. British Rail introduced its standard classes onto the East Coast Main Line in the 50s, the 9Fs gaining the nickname spaceships, possibly because of the space under the boiler, which made them seem very open compared to other British locomotives. An A4-headed express is followed by another 9F. Much of the East Coast Main Line had quadruple track, as the LNER, like the Midland, handled enormous quantities of freight, principally from the northeast and Yorkshire. Freight and passenger trains needed to be kept apart, so two lines were available for each kind of traffic. British Railways also produced some Pacifics of the Britannia and Clan classes, but neither were common on the East Coast, this being a special rail tour with a Britannia. The LNER had produced enough Pacifics. York Station was the very hub of the East Coast Main Line. Once a capital city in its own right, it was the headquarters of the second constituent part of the East Coast partners, North Eastern Railway. The North Eastern came as near as any railway to having a monopoly over the territory it covered. Although York was served by many other railways, they had to use North Eastern lines to reach the city. A magnificent train shed set the station apart, and today the city houses the National Railway Museum in the former steam locomotive shed, situated in the top left-hand corner of our scene, filmed from the top of the North Eastern's Royal Station Hotel. One Pacific is heading north away from the station, whilst another approaches with a van train. York was another mecca for enthusiasts. Trains came in from the East Coast Main Line via Selby, from Leeds and Sheffield via Church Fenton, and to the north, lines stretched to Harrogate and Scarborough, as well as the northern cities of Durham and Newcastle, on their way to Scotland. Cross-country trains to the south and west also connected with the main line here. Pacifics mixed with the Thompson B1s here as well, but the indigenous mixed traffic 460s of the Northeastern were the class B16 460s, designed by Sir Vincent Raven. These fine machines survived to the 1960s, although some in rebuilt form. Northeastern design locomotives were built even by British Railways. This J72 tank was built in 1950. Two Thompson B1s head for Scarborough. The LNER was instrumental in the promotion of the East Coast holiday resorts. A foreigner intrudes, a Midland 4F. This is a reminder of the days when George Hudson's Midland Empire encompassed York. His sharp practices and subsequent fall from grace being major reasons for the formation of the Great Northern Railway to give independent access to London from the northeast. At the south end of the station, a Gresley A3 approaches with a special train for a shipping line, connecting London with the Scandinavian countries via the ferries from Tyneside. An Edinburgh to King's Cross Express calls at York, behind the last of the A4s, Seagull. Most trains called at the city after the war had suspended the non-stop streamliners, but one that didn't was the Anglo-Scottish car carrier, a predecessor to today's motor rail. On we go again, northwards, enjoying first-class luxury and separate compartments. Today, all trains on the route have open-style coaches. In order to undertake the long non-stop runs from the capital, locomotives had to have methods to replenish their water supplies en route. For this purpose, water troughs were laid between the rails, and the locomotive's forward motion was used to scoop it up into their tenders whilst on the move. Darlington Station, offset from the main line, is situated in the city where railways can truly be said to have started. The North Eastern Railway built its locomotive engineering workshops at Darlington alongside the historic line from Stockton through the city to Shildon and Bishop Auckland. This pioneer railway, built before any thoughts were given to a railway network reaching London, ran from west to east at right angles to the eventual main line, as it was built for industrial rather than passenger use. Darlington has remained important for the railway. Its locomotive sheds serviced the Great Pacifics to the end of steam's working days. Newcastle, and the famous bridges over the Tyne. Here was the industrial heartland of the Northeast, birthplace of railways and George Stephenson, their father. The East Coast Main Line came over the river into the great Newcastle Central Station. The station was pure Northeastern Railway territory, and in an unusual display of nostalgia in the 1950s, British Railways acknowledged this by repainting the Newcastle Station Pilot, another J-72 tank, in the livery of the old Northeastern Railway. Britain's most complex set of point work was situated at the north end of Newcastle Station, where an express with the Scottish capital behind another A4 is seen departing. Newcastle was one of the few cities outside London with a well-developed suburban system, that to the north of the city being electrified on the third rail principle. We leave the Tyne and cross the border country via Berwick-on-Tweed and round southeast Scotland onto the metals of the third East Coast partner, the North British Railway. Despite its name, it was a Scottish company, its line only just crossing the border to Berwick. It took the East Coast Main Line up through the Scottish capital, over the famous Forth and Tay bridges, to the ultimate destination of the island's east coast, Aberdeen. Edinburgh was the railway's own capital. A magnificent station was built in the heart of the city at Waverley, probably the best positioned station in any city. We approach it from the south as the rails fan out to serve the multitude of platforms. Waverley was built by the North British as a through station, so trains could carry on without having to reverse either to Aberdeen or to Glasgow. It was, and still is, the destination of the fastest regular trains in Britain. In the age of steam, the A4s brought the Coronation into the city in 6 hours, with one brief stop on the way. Today, the Intercity 225s do the run in a shade over 4 hours. Here at the north end, an A4 leaves for Aberdeen with the train starting at Waverley in the last days of steam. But then came the second age of steam, and with it an A4 has once again regularly graced the rails at Edinburgh Waverley. This was a special train run from the Scottish capital to its industrial capital in 1992 to celebrate 150 years of railways between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Edinburgh has a suburban system, known as the Sub, which describes a complete circle around the south side of the city. It's seen many special steam workings in recent years, especially at Christmas. Quite a variety of locomotives have been seen. The Black 5 follows the K1 just seen. As previously touched upon, Edinburgh's railway is in the heart of the city. The departure north from Waverley is through the Princes Street Gardens in a cutting. Leaving the capital to head over the Forth Bridge on the occasion of a run to Aberdeen is the Scottish flagship, A4 number 6009 Union of South Africa. This streamliner spent its entire working life in Scotland and, on retirement, was purchased by the present ScotRail's chairman John Cameron. Today it regularly works steam specials throughout the country. Today's locomotive maintenance facilities at Portobello on the south side of the city are seen as the preserved K1, LNER designed but not built. It was built after British Railways was formed, heads for Waverley off the Sub. Some steam specials have started in Edinburgh and travelled to England via Glasgow in recent years. Here a Black 5 gets to grips with a train organised by the Scottish Railway Preservation Society. Destination Carlisle. Carlisle, the great border city, is once again the capital for steam workings today. The famous Settle and Carlisle Railway was the northern end of the Midland Railway's trunk route between the two countries, and Carlisle itself was the location of a great station on the rival route to Scotland, the West Coast Main Line. This was the LMS Railway's focal point for its Anglo-Scottish traffic. Its two constituents, the Midland and LNWR, met here, and it was for the first of these services that Sir William Stanier designed and built the LMS's first Pacific locomotives, a full 10 years after the LNER had built theirs. This locomotive, preserved today, was the first production LMS Pacific, the forerunner of a batch of 10 Princess Royals. They were to be supplemented by the later Duchesses, which we saw earlier, one of which also works today, Duchess of Hamilton, owned by the National Railway Museum at York. This engine is 46203 Princess Margaret Rose, one of 3 Stanier Pacifics, out of 5 preserved, to run today. The third working Pacific, Princess Elizabeth, was briefly seen as Maggie Rose came out of the shed at Carlisle Upperby Depot. 30 years earlier, the very first LMS Pacific, the prototype, number 46200, the Princess Royal, was on the scrap line of the same Upperby Depot, along with the Royal Scot, whilst an Eastern Region V2 visited the shed. A Duchess was still active, the zenith of LMS power, whilst a Jubilee was resting amongst the daisies, before pushing them up. The West Coast Main Line was legendary for its 2 great climbs over the mountain ranges, which stood in its path from London to Scotland. Between Carlisle and Lancaster, the line climbs over the great summit at Shap, and then follows the course of the River Lune through its gorge in the mountains. This was the image of the West Coast Main Line, and like its East Coast rival, both freight and passenger traffic was intense. This passenger train on the ascent to Shap is followed by a freight in the Lune Gorge, both headed by members of the 842-strong Black 5 class 460s. These were the LMS equivalent to the LNER V2 and B1 classes. Another 5 heads north, passing a banking engine running light downhill. Many heavy trains required the assistance of these bankers over the severe gradients. One of the numerous Jubilee Class 460s, named after places, events and personalities of the Empire, is seen at Oxenholme, a junction for the Windermere branch serving the Lake District. The engine is Hood, and her progress at this point, on her ascent to Shap, has ground to a halt. She is therefore to stop and summon the assistance of a banker, illustrating the use of these helper engines. The Jubilees were the standard second-rank express locomotives of the LMS and were particularly associated with the Midland Main Line, where they were for some time the most powerful locomotives permitted for passenger use. On the outskirts of London, we have another glimpse of one of the frontline power, a Stanier Duchess, as she runs past us to pick up a train and then heads her train on a last Duchess rail tour in the early 1960s. we return to the London suburbs, to the major station at Watford Junction on the West Coast Main Line. Here a Class 9F is seen with a freight to be followed by a Black 5 running light engine. Watford was on the original London and Birmingham Railway, the forerunner of the LNWR, and the first trunk route in Britain. The LNWR grew to become the largest joint stock company in the world and was the major partner of the LMS Railway. Unlike the East Coast, the West Coast Main Line was owned through England by the one company. A further LMS constituent, the Caledonian Railway, was the LNWR's partner north of the border. A filthy Jubilee, unusually working on freight duties, drifts through Watford before another freight follows it, behind an Ivet Class 4 mogul. The last days of steam were nigh, as the overhead electrification masts in the background testify. Steam would no longer be allowed to work from the capital on this route once the wires were energized. Electrification took place in the early 1960s, and from then on, steam engines wore a yellow stripe through their number on the cab side to denote their ban under the wires. A last glimpse of an LMS Stanier Duchess follows. Electrification displaced them from the principal work, and they were withdrawn immediately, not being transferred onto more menial tasks. To the end, they remained in good condition. But steam hasn't gone from the smoke yet. For a period in the 1980s and early 90s, regular steam workings ran from the last terminus, Marylebone. This included the most famous one of all, the East Coast Flying Scotsman. Here we see Scotsman running over the line through the Chilterns via Ruislip to High Wycombe, where she was to give many children who'd never seen a real working steam engine a Christmas treat, as she was used for Santa specials into and out of London. Here she prepares to run to Marylebone from High Wycombe. Through the suburbs, she brought cheer to a rainy day as she passed passengers awaiting an underground train at Dollis Hill. Marylebone hasn't been the only London terminus to witness steam in recent years. Here a Castle Class 460, 5029 Nunney Castle, is seen leaving Paddington Station on the western region, with a train for Stratford-upon-Avon. Quite a shock to the passengers of the modern Intercity 125 she'll soon be passing. The steam route from Paddington was cut back to Ealing in 1992 due to remodelling the track at the terminus, and from May 1993 no more use could be made of the line through the Chilterns. Our last glimpse of steam out of the capital, therefore, is of British Railways Pioneer Standard Pacific Britannia, leaving the Great Western Main Line and London with a train for Stratford-upon-Avon.